All right, tell me what advantages you think white has here. What else? Well, that's just going to be entailed by higher bridge, right? So I wouldn't really classify that as a second advantage here. Can you elaborate? Correct. Yeah. So basically, the primary advantages white has here is a higher bridge and a full gen when they get the next split. And also because they have the higher bridge, they're able to keep the pressure even after dying, while also having a bigger usage advantage for the next rush. So those would just be examples of observations like you make that specifically pertain to this scenario, right? So what generalizations could you make derived from those advantages or derived from the scenario? Well, no, because that generalization would be too broad in this context, right? That would just refer to the scope of like any number of scenarios. When we're referring to generalizations regarding this scenario, we have to include the, the necessary variables like the bridge and whatnot. So, for example, a generalization you can make here is that creating a higher bridge lends you the potential to get more resources for future rushes as well as maintain pressure easier. Does that make sense? Yeah, so now that we have this generalization, what other generalizations with the current status of the game do you think would encapsulate that principle with other context in a different context? Because of the context for, say, having a full gender split is useful in regards to higher bridge. Are there any other scenarios where a principle like that would be relevant in this game? Well, the answer is no, because the current progression of the game is just high bridges. So the next the next obvious question would be referring to other factors that aren't relevant to the first rush that are entailed by the hybrid, right? So, for instance, what do you think? What do you think would be a long-term advantage of having this hybrid derived from the principle that you can maintain pressure as well as get a full split? All right. Did you hear my question, by the way? Did you hear my question? Correct. Yes. This is an example of abstraction, by the way, right? So we look at one generalization present in the game, right? Which is usually derived from what you're doing in the current moment. And then we assess entailed variables that are not relevant to the actual generalization that we observed or the actual things you're doing in the moment. So the way we can ascertain what other things are entailed is just it's just assessing what realistic advantages are going to be garnered through having this bridge as well as having more resources, being able to split. So one way to do this is to realize, well, a consequence of having more resources and being able to keep long-term pressure against our first rush is that we're likely to get our first rush relatively quickly. And then that will likely be able to initiate other bridges across the map, right? So that would be one example of an abstraction of a high bridge. So does that make sense? Why aren't you typing in the party chat, by the way? All right. Do you understand so far? Just to be sure, can you paraphrase what I've just said? The part that I just mentioned in regards to an example of an abstraction you can make. Yes. Correct. And do you understand how this translates to other enemies, right? Because that same principle would obviously apply to them as well. So if you are at a disadvantage, then the consequences of not having that high bridge and not having the resource advantage be applicable for you, and you could just make that abstraction for the other enemies. Does that make sense? Right. So this moves on to my second part. You want to be able to get a higher conceptual grasp of the game you're playing. So whenever you're executing a particular task in Bedwars, that task is directly in front of you, and you don't need to use your brain power. However, for other external factors that you're not paying attention to, like the status of the first rush of other teams, you're not really wary of what's about to happen or the status of the game because you're not aware of what the other enemies are doing. So this leads me to my other point where you don't actually focus particularly hard on what you're currently doing, and your main focus is derived from the factors of the game that you usually wouldn't pay attention to. What I mean is, if say you're doing your first rush, instead of paying attention to specific tactics pertaining to your first rush, you pay attention to the rest of the game around you in hopes that your subconscious will be able to be an effective placeholder for your execution of the first rush rather than focusing your conscious effort on the first rush. Does that make sense? And do you understand why that is the case, right? Keep in mind when I ask you, does that make sense? I'm expecting you to understand why rather than understanding the English. Yes, that's correct. And I explained this yesterday, but basically, because you have an understanding of these generalizations for any given task, you should already just be aware. You should already know what to do just by muscle memory alone. Just because you have like lots of generalizations that you can like reference when executing any given task. So you shouldn't actually have to think in the moment every time. You should just be able to understand what to do that would encapsulate the scope of any given generalization. So what I mean is, if say you have a generalization for the high bridging, like you're able to maintain pressure more, you're able to get like more resources, you should be able to just derive specific tactics pertaining to that generalization without actually having to think about it at all. So you would know exactly what to do to execute like tactics that would be relevant to that generalization. Does that make sense? So basically what I mean is when you have a generalization for say your first rush, no, I'm referring to all right, so when you have a generalization for say your first rush, you understand that having that bridge will be useful for your team for the resource advantage and maintaining long-term pressure against your first rush. So basically, you should be able to intuitively grasp all of the tactics that you need to execute in order to encompass that generalization. Now, does that make sense? So, for example, if you have the high bridge against your opponent, and you know that you should buy, for instance, water, right? Because you know that the high bridge will give you pressure against the enemy. So you can just buy water to actually maintain that pressure, which would be a relevant aspect of like the entailments of having the high bridge. Does that make sense? And inversely, And of course, counterfactually, if you're the one under pressure by your enemy, you should be able to understand certain generalizations that are entailed by being pressured on and know how to counter like the enemy's plays. Exactly. That is exactly what I'm saying. And you understand why that ties into correct. Yes, exactly. Because you understand that these elements of the game would be best to execute the general principle you have in mind. And you understand why this ties into the fact that you should focus on factors outside of what you're doing currently, right? That's correct. So now now that we understand this, and I'm assuming we can both agree on this so far, right? Like everything I've said so far. Right. So now that we've agreed to this, now the next part is just exactly how to implement this model of thinking. Because obviously, when we're analyzing external factors, we shouldn't just rely on a brute force method to derive like other variables of the game to ascertain its nature. So now the question just becomes what would be the most effective way to actually ascertain external factors of the game. So basically, you just have to. There's like a few ways to do this. One is just being able to arrive at like other factors of the game through abstraction, right? The other is to not utilize abstraction and just directly observe other components of the game. So, in regards to the abstraction portion of analyzing external factors of the game, you basically just, as I said previously, look at the entailments of the given task you're executing at the moment and realize how that translates to the long term for other aspects of the game that are expected to occur given the consequences of what you're currently doing. The other way to analyze external factors is to just directly look at what's at the current status of the game external to what you're currently doing. Most people would do the latter process. They would just directly look at external factors of the game without actually relying on abstraction. But most people don't utilize this, being able to derive seemingly unrelated conclusions from what they're doing at the current moment. Does that make sense? Correct. And in regards to the second part I mentioned, correct. Yes. Now that we have these two models of observing certain variables in Bedwars, is there actually a way to connect these two together to make an overarching abstraction? So what I mean is you rely on the scope of the external observations you make, and you rely on the abstraction you do. So what I mean is, say you observe a non-abstract part of the game external to what you're currently doing, and say you observe an abstract part of the game. You notice that obviously the non-abstract part of the observation, non-abstract observation you made obviously has specific elements that you can derive generalizations of as well, right? So basically what this entails is that is it possible to compare the generalizations of the non-abstract observation you made to the abstract observation you made? Because what we'll notice is when you're looking at an abstract observation, that essentially the observation itself isn't abstract in nature. It's just the process to derive that observation was abstract. So basically what this entails is that the observation that you made that was derived from abstraction will obviously have like constituents of its own that can create a generalization or so. So basically you can then analyze the elements of that generalization to the elements of the non-abstract observations generalization, and then see if there's like any relevant connection that would determine the state of the game. Does that make sense? So basically, the non-abstract observation you made and comparison to the abstract observation you made will both have generalizations that you can derive. And the goal here would basically be to connect these generalizations together to see if there's any like similar element that would between these two generalizations that would determine the current status of the game. No. Remember when I pointed out how there's two methods of observing external factors to the game? And you would agree that these observations that you make would have generalizations that you can derive from those observations? Correct. And you remember when I said that the observation you make, one of the observation you make derived from abstraction won't be abstract in nature. It's merely the process to which you got that observation that's abstract. Right. So you can thereby create an abstraction from the external observations you make. Which wouldn't you agree? Sure. Yeah. Right. But I'll just give an example to clarify what I mean. So going back to my initial example I gave, I basically said that because of the high bridge, like the generalization of being able to get more resources because of the high bridge as well as maintain pressure, and that would lead to being able to take out your first rush sooner, as well as being able to have access to mid and diamonds sooner because of that. So you understand that, and then what would the generalizations be that you could make derived from getting diamonds and M sooner? Yes, that is one generalization you can make. You you also have to you should also consider that this is kind of similar to the hybrid, right? Where you have the initiative for pressure because of this. So there's like a few generalizations you can make, but so then you understand why a generalization like this would be more useful than a generalization like having access to mid/diamond sooner because of the high bridge, right? Correct. You know useful information about the expected status of the game. And similarly, if you are disadvantaged, you will also know the expected status of the game. Right. And then you can kind of derive like ways to assess whether or not like having this advantage or being able to like fully utilize this part of this element of the game is better than like other elements of the game, right? So then you can kind of create like tactics that would either do your best to actually utilize the element of the game despite not having the initiative to do that, or you can ignore that knowing that there are other elements of the game that would disadvantage you more if you try to implement that. So this is actually a very useful generalization that you make, right? Because it doesn't just tell you like what's going to happen. It also tells you like the advantages and disadvantages you'll have. So that's just like obviously much more informational. And similarly, if you do like external observations without abstraction, you can thereby assess whether or not like this element of the game will apply to the other observations you make. And then you can just have a good understanding of the status of like all the players and whether or not they'll be able to implement this overarching like element of the game into their gameplay. So it's basically this is basically like the process you want to implement, and you ideally want to be able to like subconsciously understand these generalizations and their abstractions that are directly derived from your gameplay. And you should really only be focusing on like the overarching element of the game, like um winning, like preventing others from getting stacked and whatnot, like in the future. And then you can like just do like observations that are specific to that element if needed. Does that make sense? Right. And you'll notice that the more the game progresses, the less, I think, like observations you make, just because there are less possible states of the game at that point that could happen. Because like later, obviously, like when the game progresses more, the game will like have a the game will like have a like an obvious, I guess, what's the word for it? Status, I suppose, to like what will unfold. Because obviously, when the first rush is happening, there are many things that could potentially happen. But as the more the game unfolds, the less possible things will happen for obvious reasons. So then the observations become less and less abstract at that point, the more the game unfolds. Because you'll already have like the maximum conceptual understanding of the game, like in the late stages. And then you can just do like specific observations. You should still try to utilize external observations, obviously, but there'll just be less to analyze. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'll continue this replay just so I can, so you can visualize what I mean. All right. So if you were white here, what would you be thinking right now? And give me the answer that you would just do, that you would just do normally. Don't give me the answer of like what you just learned. Right. And you see how something like this, you've played thousands, likely thousands of games with similar scenarios. So it's just obviously just a waste of time to like consciously think about this. You should just know this by muscle memory. So, and then obviously if you're, have you noticed that when you're playing games, you rely on live feedback for external like information? Like for example, relying on the scoreboard or chat messages rather than just focusing on that yourself. Yeah, so and you see, and obviously you see why this would be bad in terms of time, right? Because yeah, because you have less time to actually fully understand what's going on external to you. So you obviously you have less time to plan. Yeah. So what will, using the model I just laid out, what would you ideally want to analyze here as a white? Right, but you can still rely on external stimuli to know what red and blue are doing, like tab and chat messages. Because if there's no way for you to analyze what red and blue is doing without reference to chat messages and whatnot, then you just use those tools at your disposal, and then just focus the rest of your working memory on the observations you can just directly make. Does that make sense? Yeah. So also, do you see any flaws with you just focusing on the state of yellow and pink here? So there's what? Well, no, because you can still give comms that are directly relevant to what you're doing. It's just that your thoughts won't be derived from that. So basically, how you would want to communicate your teammate with like the abstractions you're making is give like the comms that are necessary to perform the task at hand, and then just give the rest of the comms that are about the plans like external to that. So, and also there's another flaw with just analyzing the scope of what yellow and green is doing, right? Because this doesn't actually really give you information as to what the status of the game will be in the long term. This really tells you that this just tells you that like what yellow and green are doing, but you don't like really connect those pieces of information to like make like an overall abstraction to like the nature of what's entailed from that. So what would you what like overarching abstraction would you make derived from what yellow and pink are doing? Right, but more so, what does that entail? So basically, realistically, you should. Oh, before I go into like that, you see like why, even though you have to look up more things, it's still really easy to actually analyze these external factors because you notice that these bridges serve as just like instant visual cues to deriving generalizations, right? So there's just like visual cues that you can instantly like derive stuff from, right? Yeah, but it's precise enough to get like an accurate gist of what's going on. So you don't actually need to like think about that at all. You can just look around and just immediately know what's going on. Yeah. And then you just like the thing you actually think about is like what what like the status of the game will be because of these observations. So you actually shouldn't be really thinking about the abstractions that are derived from generalizations at all. It's really, the only thing you should really be thinking about is the abstraction you make from the external observations you make and those generalizations and how those elements connect with each other to determine the overall status. Does that make sense? Right. So going back to what I was saying earlier, there there are specific observations that you can make that rely on visual cues. There's like certain bridges, the positions of players, and that can just give you a gist of like who's expected to take out their first rush sooner and whatnot. So saying that the M's will be evenly distributed amongst all three teams isn't very accurate because it's just relying on the notion that they will be able to take out the first rush sooner or around the same time. But that's not necessarily true because it just is obviously based around the status of the first rush. Because obviously you would say a team like Pink, right, is a lot more likely to take out the first rush than green and yellow. And you understand why, right? Because it's a 2v1 top. Yellow's more likely to win. And Pink is just full pressure. So you just like rely, you just make quick calculations of like these visual cues and whatnot too. And so basically, what would be the expected like outcome just based around this information that you notice as white team? Yeah, but we also have to consider that an observation like this is derived from the notion that that will occur. We're merely looking at a probabilistic expectation. So we should just consider that at the back of our minds. And then just obviously update our information if that doesn't go as planned, right? So then the status of the game would differ. And you can just make those calculations again, which ideally would be quite easy if you're used to this process. So basically if like say your prediction was reliable and this actually did occur, then what would be the entailments of that? Utilizing the process I laid out. What specifically would you realize? Correct. And then you just understand just because of that Pink has like more tactics they can utilize. And you also understand that Pink will likely focus on a team just based on like specific elements. And you can so once you realize like the nature of this game will be based around that, you also then can just calculate that other teams will do like expected actions just based around this. But you should also like consider that other teams will utilize live feedback rather than your process that you're utilizing for obvious reasons. So basically, if you expect other teams to utilize live feedback, there's this, then you can kind of make like an expectation of like just based around the status of the game being this in the future, what like the other team, like how will the other teams likely counter it just based on past experience? And usually speaking, you can rely on past experience for this as well, so long as you can grasp the overall nature of the game. So if you grasp the overall nature of the game, you can, for the most part, just rely on just past experience to ascertain what the other teams will do based on like what's going on for them. So then once you grasp like the status of the game being like that currently, you can then kind of like expect like notice like other future statuses of the game, but your plan should really just be derived from like the status of the game that you observed initially there, and then you can just make calculations in the future as you go along. And then this kind of just progresses towards like less and less elements being present in the game with the longer the game progresses, and just less and less information you have to consider. Like in the broad sense. Obviously there's gonna be like more individual tactics that you have to consider because of more items, but like the overall nature of the game will be simpler. Does that make sense? Yeah, so I'll continue the replay, I suppose. Um, but yeah, as we can see, like this is why utilizing visual cues like chat is important as well. Um, so also relying on live feedback is actually good because when you're doing your initial assessments without relying on live feedback, you're just utilizing a probabilistic model to gauge what's expected to happen. But with live feedback, you know exactly like what will happen because it already did happen, right? Does that make sense? So really we should like change like the scope of our actions depending on whether or not it's a probabilistic model or if it's a live feedback model. Obviously, the higher the probability, the more the scope of like your actions based around external stimuli will be matched with the probabilistic model and the live feedback model. So, for example, if there's like a 15% confidence threshold of the status of the game being derived from pink getting their first rush out and getting mid center, then obviously you wouldn't put all of your mental effort on the scope of that. You would just like observe like, okay, this could happen, but you wouldn't just like put like all your eggs in that basket. You wouldn't say, well, this will happen. So we should just plan our like entire game based around that. So the trick here is to right, exactly. The trick here is to just have like these probabilities in the back of your mind as long as they're relevant enough to consider. And then you just can reference one that's happened just based on live feedback. Does that make sense? Yeah, so we now know, just based on this, we can say, oh, pink did that. Yellow and like, green might have the initiative now, and yada yada. But we can still say, well, just based on how gray is playing. No, not conceptually, at least. The ones I'm mentioning right now? Yeah, they're not supposed to be complicated. Bedwars, oh, the ones you said. Wait, can you repeat which ones you said? But still, like the abstractions you make aren't supposed to be complicated. Bedwars is mainly about common sense decision making. Oh, that. Yeah. I mean that model isn't necessarily bad. It's just it is not very informative. So you can't really like derive other elements from that model. So it's not a useful model, but it's not necessarily wrong, if that makes sense. But yeah, there are also you should also like take into consideration like the archetypes certain visual cues serve as. So for example, water that serves as the archetype of like extended pressure as well as like a higher intensity in the bed. And then that gives like and then with utilizing the probabilistic model, that gives higher credence to the notion that the team that like initiates the water as well as like certain other visual cues like the bridges they have and whatnot will be able to um, like make the status of the game unfold as if that team would be have the initiative with M's and diamonds, and thus having like more choices for what teams to push. Does that make sense? Yeah. So there's basically just so basically there's just like certain you can basically like think of like certain structures across the map as like elements that could increase the probability of certain entailments occurring or certain like abstractions that you make actually occurring. So yeah. Like we can see here. Yeah, I guess. But yeah, your predictions seem to be right about gray. So yeah, what is that? Sure. Like, yeah, that makes sense. I haven't really gone over like the methodologies to actually like utilize this model, like the cognitive tricks you can do to actually effectively observe these things without like your working memory being shit. I could do that some other time though, if you want. I haven't thought about it though, so I don't know like what like tricks you could do to actually observe these things without like putting much effort in. But yeah. But yeah, so basically, like if the status of the game is like gray having the initiative, for example, we can kind of like we can kind of derive like expected outcomes. But there's some like certain calculations that aren't actually useful at all. because you just have so much experience with it, you just know that's going to happen. For example, like other teams going mid to counter that as well and whatnot. Like you don't actually need to observe that every game. You just really need to pay attention to like the status of the game that is unfolded currently. But like because of how Bedwars is in its nature, like most of the like elements of Bedwars you've already experienced in past games, right? So you already expect like certain things to happen. It's really just being able to like pay attention to these things every game and knowing like specifically what to do regarding that each time. Also, you see why this model doesn't actually like really help you improve in Bedwars, right? It just helps you play Bedwars already. Because this model's just derived from the fact that just derived from your current understanding of the game. Because obviously you couldn't just like create brand new concepts live. Like it's just like the observations you make are just derived from what you know currently. And I forgot to mention this yesterday, but that's also partially why I thought like your 3 bullet points it were not relevant to abstraction. Because like the way you stated them would be useful for like actually coming up with new ideas. It depends. Because yeah, but the thinking model I espoused would improve your gameplay, I think. It just wouldn't improve what you already know. Well, not necessarily, but it wouldn't like directly improve what you know, but you could like I guess like be instantiate new knowledge from this model. Just even though that wouldn't like pertain to the model itself. Yeah. That is correct. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about the model for now. We can go over something else if you want. What are your thoughts? All right.